Hello ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. All the money that goes donated at the doors obviously helps to sustain our programme. So for those unaware, York Uni is completely not-for-profit. So all the money goes back in, so we have amazing speakers like Dominic Grieve QC tonight. So without further ado, we'll let everyone take it away.
Okay, so just a nice start. You studied modern history at Oxford. What was your time at university like? Do you have any stories or any?
It was immense fun. I had a marvellous time at university. I was very lucky. I was in a very nice college, Magdalen, which has nice grounds and could go punting on the River Charle at the bottom of the grounds. I read history. I had some fantastic history tutors. It was the subject I wanted to read. I'd already decided I was quite keen to be a lawyer, but my father was kind enough to say that if I wanted to take an extra year to read the subject of my choice, he had no objection. I did a mixture of sort of 19th century and medieval history. I had a great sort of taste for medieval history, sort of late medieval, 14th, 15th century, and also 19th and early 20th century European history.
Did you do Wars of the Roses?
It was the Roses, yes. We did the 100 Years' War, Battle of Agincourt. We're coming up to the anniversary, and certainly had a lot about Henry V's policies in France. A lot on France. I'm partly French by background, so I'm bilingual. I did France, politics, literature, religion and society in the 19th and early 20th century, which was great fun.
And you were chairman of the Conservative Association?
And I was chairman of the Conservative Association. The one joy of the history course at Oxford was that you had an exam at the end of your first term, and then there were no other university exams until the end of your third year. So it was regarded as being a course which encouraged idleness, or alternatively, extracurricular activities. And I therefore quite enjoyed myself, and probably in my second year did not do as much work as I should have done. It did quite a lot with the Conservative Association, which interested me. Spoke a bit at the Union, the Debating Society, and had lots of very good friends, nice summer travel, travelled around Turkey one year, which in those days was quite exotic. And just, it was a wonderful experience, and most of the closest friends are the people who I met at university.
And what led you to go into politics?
Well, it may have been fated in one sense, but I'm not sure it entirely was. My father was in Parliament. He was a backbench MP, he was Member of Parliament for Solihull from 1964 to 1983. And when I was at school, my school was just behind Westminster Abbey, and I was a weekly boarder. And in the early 70s, when I was there, sort of 15, 16-year-old, if I wanted a good tea, I could pop over the road and send a note to my father who would take to give me a cup of tea, and then I could get a ticket to go up into the public gallery, and I would stay there until supper time when you could go back to the school. And so in that time I saw some of the great debates, and there were great orators in those days. You had Michael Foot, you had Enoch Powell, who was undoubtedly somebody who the Commons listened to. It was the era of Ted Heath and Harold Wilson. James Callaghan. There were lots of very vigorous debates in Parliament. And so I think that probably was what whetted my appetite. I think that far more than the fact that my father was an MP did it. But I always wanted to have a career outside of politics. And although when I came down from university, I was encouraged to stand for the local council. I had 4 years on the council when I was in my sort of late 20s, early 30s, and then got on the candidates list. The irony is that by the time I was actually selected and elected for a winnable seat, I had a very happy career at the bar. I was married to another barrister. I had 2 very small children. And actually, I had just about reconciled myself to not going into Parliament at all. And indeed had a rather curious conversation with my wife just before the 97 election, in which I told her I was going to take a few days off to help join the election. I was going to come off the candidates list afterwards. I was going to concentrate on being a lawyer. She breathed a sigh of relief and thought this was a fantastic idea, and 7 days later I was the candidate for Beaconsfield, and 3.5 weeks later I was the Member of Parliament. So the world moves in odd ways, but yes, the political interest had been there.
And what was it like to, what's it like to work in cabinet? What was it like to be in number 10? And do you have any stories and anecdotes or anything you'd like to share?
Cabinet is very interesting. Somebody said, I think rightly, because we're not allowed to talk about what we do in cabinet because it's all confidential. But I think there are a number of things which I can sort of describe about cabinet. The first one is that historically, in the last 25 years, people have said, well, cabinet is declining as being the centrepiece of decision making. But the interesting thing about the coalition government is that it restored cabinet government, certainly for quite a time. It may be that towards the end there was more backroom discussions taking place. But one of the features of cabinet is that it may be that ministers are unwilling to speak out because they might damage their position with the Prime Minister. But of course, when you have a coalition government, you have some ministers in cabinet who are not beholden to the Prime Minister at all for being there, so they feel entitled to say roughly whatever they like. And that then encourages other people to speak their mind. So my memory of cabinet was that we had some very vigorous and interesting discussions. And actually, I think one of the reasons why the coalition worked, it survived the 5 years, which I wasn't entirely sure it would at the outset, was that there was a considerable honesty of discourse and a willingness to tolerate division and reconcile division and differences of view that I think in an ordinary one-party cabinet would have been regarded as quite extraordinary. Other vignettes, the cabinet is very big now and the cabinet room hardly capable of holding the numbers of people present, particularly with the civil servants and other hangers-on. I, as an Attorney General, was down at the bottom of the, historically, down at the bottom of the table. And the table got longer and longer until one day I said, if it carries on like this, we're going to be in the Prime Minister's office because we just hit the wall and go through the double doors. And that, I think, may be a problem for the future if you want to have discussion. Number 10 is a very domestic environment. The only other vignette I can think of was being summoned to a meeting in the Cabinet room, which was not the Cabinet meeting. I used to have a very nice memory of this because the meeting was cancelled at the last minute, but neither I nor the Home Secretary were told this. And so we both arrived and walked into the Cabinet room and found that the only other thing in the Cabinet room was the number 10 cat sitting in the middle of the table, waiting to have clearly a lengthy discussion with us, and nobody else had turned up. I wish I'd actually taken a mobile phone photograph of the Home Secretary, the cat and myself.
What's it like to work with the Lib Dems?
It was very easy to work with the Lib Dems. The personal relations were, for the most part, very good. Now, obviously, in the latter stages, you've seen quite a lot of public division. But there was always an understanding that the nature of coalition meant that the public division was bound to be, a willingness to express different views, was going to be present in a way in which you wouldn't have with one-party government. I myself had a small government department. I'm head of the law officers. That's the Attorney General, the Solicitor General, and the Lord Advocate, the Advocate General. The Advocate General was Lord Wallace of Tankeness, and my relations with Jim Wallace could not have been better. And indeed, partly, probably, because we had to approach most problems from a lawyer's point of view rather than a political point of view. I just can't think of any occasion when we had any substantial difference, or certainly we may have sometimes had issues to discuss together, but they were easily resolved and there was a high level of mutual trust. But I actually think the same applied to the Prime Minister's relations with Nick Clegg, George Osborne's with Danny Alexander, and whilst there may have been some members of in Cabinet who sort of a bit pricklier, on the whole, I think that the coalition worked precisely because these personal relationships, on the face of it, were good, and because there was a very clear, I think it's going to be quite interesting for them after this coming election, there really was, in setting up the coalition, there was a very clear set of objectives which we negotiated. And if you remember, at the time, the Prime Minister was quite criticised because people said, particularly Conservatives, you're giving away too much. And I remember his making the point, and he was absolutely right about this. He said, if this marriage is going to last, it can't be a forced marriage. It has got to be one where there is the give and take takes place at the outset, you know what you're going to do, and you stick to the script. And whilst there were a couple of blips, one of which I think is very regrettable, which was the issue of the boundaries, which I do think was wrong of our partners, because we're now fighting an election on constituency boundaries on first past the post that are 10 years old and not satisfactory. Virtually everything else was the Liberal. The Liberals, of course, would say we let them down over House of Lords reform. But there was clearly a very high level of resistance. But apart from those two things, on the face of it, we stuck to our agreement, and because we saw likewise on the economic challenges we were facing, and most things were subordinated to that, we were able to operate very well together. Well, I'm very proud to have been a member of the coalition.
Just slightly more topical. So you went through great lengths to try and prevent the so-called Black Spider memos, Prince Charles's letters, from being published. What do you think the implications would be now that we've ruled?
Well, I doubt actually that the implications are anything like of serious quality. If they are eventually published, which they clearly will be, I think that they're now carrying out the redaction which is necessary to deal with third parties, which has to be done in any freedom of information request. It may be that when the public come to read these letters, they may not find them as sensational as some have suggested. I happen to think, however, that I have no regrets about the decision I took, and I continue to believe that that decision was correct. The interesting thing is that when the case eventually went to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's ruling against me was not on the basis of how I had exercised my discretion, which never came into the picture. Indeed, a couple of the Supreme Court judges who found against me were kind enough to say that my discretion had been, as far as they could see, they find it difficult to fault its reasonableness. But what they said was that as a matter of law, they didn't like, effectively, that Parliament in the Freedom of Information Act had enacted, I think, a rather bizarre system by which there was an executive override of a Superior Court of Records decision, namely the upper tier tribunal. And they thought that was so unusual that unless Parliament had spelt it out in black and white, they weren't going to follow it, because they thought it undermined basic principles of the separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive. Now, the critique of the Supreme Court on that is a very reasonable one. But ironically, I don't think that was Parliament intending to undermine the judiciary at all when it did it. I think Parliament was bending over backwards to try and give them maximum latitude to freedom of information, because when Freedom of Information Act was first introduced, the decisions of the tribunal were going to be advisory, and then the government would decide whether it wanted to accept it. And during the passage of the bill, the government decided to move from advisory to accepting that it could be compelled to hand stuff over, but said that in certain circumstances there would be an executive override. And I had to operate that system. I have to say, I think the Supreme Court decision is interesting, because I have to say I don't think Parliament was in any doubt about what it was doing when it enacted the legislation. And so some people have argued that this is an example of the judiciary ignoring Parliament's clear decision. But I don't think I'm going to get very hung up on that. I took a decision which I thought was correct. Parliament has in fact subsequently enacted legislation to protect the Prince of Wales's correspondence. The reason for protecting the Prince of Wales's correspondence I can explain very simply. The Prince of Wales is in an unusual position because as he is the heir to the throne, he sees government documents. He has access to state papers which are sent to him as they are to the Queen, so he understands how the government's policy making is taking place. He then goes off, and that's part of what's called the Education Convention. He then goes off and goes around the country visiting things. Lots of people raise with him all sorts of problems. This isn't working. This is working. Do you know that although the government may have done X, Y, and Z, in practice, it's not happening? And I think it's very much in the public interest that the Prince of Wales should be able to write privately to ministers to explain what his thinking is on things that he has seen or he has registered, particularly because he will be aware of what the government is doing through his access to the state paper system. And you cannot do that if your correspondence is going to be put into the public domain, which is why, in fact, Parliament has now legislated to prevent that happening. So that's the reason. As I say, people will draw their own conclusion when the time comes as to whether these letters are, how they view it. I'm not losing sleep over this particular matter, but I still happen to believe that the reasoning behind my decision was correct. And to that extent, the upper tier tribunal, which took a decision which was different from mine, I've still found very difficult, and always found rather difficult to follow.
Okay, and was your unexpected departure as Attorney General due to your opposition to withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights?
I think it probably was. I've long been of the view that although the European Convention on Human Rights is by no means a perfect document, and I think its interpretation by the court in Strasbourg has sometimes left quite a lot to be desired, and there are some challenges that flow from it through the Human Rights Act and the way it's applied here, I happen to believe it's a really important and defining statement of values, and largely, I might add, British values, which were created and drafted by British lawyers. Obviously there were other lawyers involved as well, in the late 40s and early 50s. And the ECHR is probably the single most important tool in raising standards internationally of human rights. So you can't just look at it from a British perspective. Our membership gives it credibility so that people in the Ukraine can use it, and the Ukrainian government feels compelled to accept decisions of the court. Of course, some people don't like the decisions of the court. Russia often takes a long time to implement or pay damages, and the court is suffering at the moment from the fact that with the arrival of Eastern European ex-communist states, it's been flooded with cases from countries that don't have a good rule of law tradition. But it is systematically helping those countries improve. And to take another example, Abu Qatada. Yes, it was absolute pain that it took us so long to get rid of Mr. Qatada, a thoroughly nasty piece of work. No reason why we should want to keep him in this country. But the fact is, it was a win-win. We finally got rid of him. Admittedly, it cost some money, but not prohibitively in the great scheme of things for a state. In the process, we completely transformed and overhauled the Jordanian criminal justice system for the better. We should have been celebrating that rather than viewing the glass half full or three-quarters full, rather than one or two of my colleagues who sort of viewed it as a glass half empty. Isn't it terrible that it took so long, this must never happen again? That is the convention working. It doesn't mean to say the court in Strasbourg always gets things right. I think at times it's micromanaged too much. I think it's failed to adhere to the principles of subsidiarity, of allowing national courts quite a flexibility in how they apply it. I happen to think the decision on prisoner voting was mistaken. But when all those things are said and done, I think it's a really important document. And so my colleagues would have known, the Prime Minister would have known, that I thought that any move which led us to be in a state of incompatibility with it would be reputationally damaging to the UK. And I'm not really sure in the long term would have any practical benefits, particularly as the Convention is now embedded in our constitutional settlement on devolution, and so it's very hard to see how we disentangle that. I have to say it's quite relevant to our membership of the EU, which means that if we were to withdraw from it, we might well find the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg steaming in, which would be much less pleasant than an international tribunal, because the Court of Justice in Luxembourg decisions would have direct effect. And for all those reasons, I'm sorry to sound legally techie, but for all those reasons, I think that to contemplate a policy which is likely to lead to withdrawal, as opposed to possibly having a Bill of Rights which is compatible with the Convention, is a mistake. And I'm sure the Prime Minister knew that, and I think ultimately that is why he asked me to go, or he dismissed me, I think is probably the better way to put it, and why he then issued the paper in October, which is a paper with which I've expressed my disagreement. But this debate isn't over, and actually I have a sort of quiet confidence that as this debate proceeds, if there is a Conservative government, which I very much hope there is, I am not persuaded that we will end up finding ourselves in incompatibility and out of the Council of Europe and the European Convention. So I think the more you debate this issue, the more it'll become clear that it's not in our national interest to do it.
And on the EU, of course, you don't want to leave, but why is that? Why don't you want to leave the EU?
Should make clear there might be some circumstances in which I thought that leaving the EU was necessary. But I think with the EU, you always have to draw up a sort of cost-benefit sheet. The critique of the EU is valid. Heaven knows, as Attorney General, there were days when I wanted to bang my head against the door in frustration at the way the EU operates. The EU is in many ways a rather dysfunctional organisation. People in this country tend to view the EU as being rather sort of a conspiracy. I must say, wish it were, but I mean it's not. It's a serious, in many ways, it's a seriously dysfunctional organisation with lots of internal tensions. Tensions between the Council of Ministers and the Commission and Parliament. It doesn't operate very well, and because you have so many participants, there is a constant desire to accumulate power in the centre in order to enable it to do anything. It's also driven, I had a day in court in the court in Luxembourg where my opponent, who was appearing for the Commission, said to the court, "You are a teleological court." And I nearly collapsed laughing, because as a common lawyer, teleological courts don't appeal to me at all, because they're courts which are ultimately driven by ideas and concepts. And I don't think that's right. And so pragmatism and common sense can sometimes fly out of the window. And these are real challenges. And furthermore, we're going through a crisis in the EU. There's an economic crisis. There's a crisis about the future of the Eurozone. All these things can be subject to really sensible critique. But when all those things have been said and done, people who say we should pull out have got to answer a few basic questions. As our economic well-being is, I think, hugely tied in with our participation in the EU in a complete sense, can they persuade me and the public that by having some sort of free trade agreement, our economic prosperity would not be compromised? I think it would be. I think the City of London's ability to stay as the European financial centre would be endangered very quickly. After all, we've already just had a challenge by the European Central Bank trying to say that you can't do euro denomination dealing in London because it's not in the Eurozone, and we succeeded in getting, fortunately, I didn't personally do the case in court, but I was a person who said we've got to challenge this. We challenged it, we were successful. I'm not sure such a challenge would be successful if we were just in a free trade agreement. So, sorry, I'm rambling on, but so I think for those, and there are lots of other reasons, our ability to negotiate free trade agreements with other entities like the United States or China, there are a lot of reasons why I think if you're going to take this step, you need to justify it by showing that 10 years down the road you haven't substantially lessened British GDP and the quality of life of British citizens.
Can we take one policy? Immigration, you could view, of course, if you stay in the European Union, that we have open door immigration, which is completely and utterly uncontrollable. And one of the government's policies was to reduce net migration to less than 100,000 per year. That wasn't made. So how do you respond to that? Because we will not be able to control our immigration levels according to UKIP if we stay in the EU.
We can certainly control our immigration from outside the EU, and indeed the government's been quite successful in doing it. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, I think that last year we gave 22,000 work permits for skilled workers to come in from outside the EU. Some people have complained it's not enough. People in India complain it's not enough, but that is what we've done, so you can do that. But it's absolutely right that as long as we are in the EU, we cannot prevent people under the freedom of movement from coming to this country to seek work. And if there is work available, then there is no justification for not letting them in. And of course, the curious irony of the last 2 years is that because the British economy has been starting to perform much better than anywhere else, I mean, just to bear in mind, last year we created more jobs in the United Kingdom than in the whole of the rest of the EU put together. So it's not surprising that people are flocking in. Now these people are not benefit scroungers. They are coming here to work, and most of them are working. There is an argument that there are more British people who are not working who ought to be doing some of these jobs. Well, even that is beginning to reduce, seeing that there are 900,000 more people now living. We've taken about 600,000 people off benefits dependency in the course of the 5 years. But these people coming into work, but I certainly think that there is infrastructure pressure, and I think there is a problem over sheer numbers, and I can see it in my own constituency. The southeast of England has really quite serious problems. We can certainly go out and negotiate changes to the benefit system and how you can access benefits. Ultimately, if the Eurozone starts to pick up, then I suspect this current flood will ease very quickly because people will go and find jobs in areas closer to their own homes. But people will go at some point to have to make a choice about this. But I simply say this of UKIP. If we have a free trade agreement, then part of that free trade agreement, if it's a Norwegian agreement, is going to be freedom of movement. So the ultimate irony, and I think my colleague Owen Patterson highlighted this in a lecture which he gave, because Owen is Eurosceptic, good friend and colleague, but Owen made the point when he gave his lecture that he didn't think leaving the EU would prevent people from European Union countries coming to this country to seek work. So I think we just be a bit careful about turning immigration into a single issue.
Slightly on that topic, on refugees, you know, recently there was the tragedy just north of Libya when the vessel capsized. How, you know, with the UK, do you think we should kind of help them, you know, with refugees, like Ban Ki-moon suggested, or Amnesty International called it a man-made tragedy, because obviously it's not the first time it's happened. I know there's been focus on trying to focus on the traffickers and stop them from actually allowing it to happen in the first place, but if people are so desperate to leave that they know that there's a chance they won't actually make it, you know, what do we do here? There's refugees and immigration.
I think there's a huge problem here, and perhaps a slight tendency by politicians right around the European continent to try to duck some of the issues. I mean, just to start with a basic issue, we cannot let people drown in the Mediterranean. So humanitarian principles must not allow that to happen. And the criticism that by lessening the area of patrol in the way that was done may have contributed to it is, I think, something that, on a humane basis, we have to review. And that indeed is why HMS Bulwark has been sent down to the Mediterranean to help. But there is a series of slight ironies about this. Of the people coming in, we don't know how many. In case I sometimes think this distinction is a bit of an artificial one. Some may be genuine asylum seekers, which under international law places an obligation on the country that receives them to look after them because they can't go back to their country of origin. But I suspect that quite a large number of the people coming probably classify as economic migrants. That's not to say that they're not fleeing difficult, indeed sometimes rather desperate conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. But there is an interesting question that if one is to take the view that they have an entitlement to come into Europe, if they take a boat across the Mediterranean and land in Sicily, why are we not permitting them to queue up at embassies in sub-Saharan Africa to get on a visa and fly in? And the answer to that is because potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people would start flooding into Europe, and Europe would be quite unable to deal with it in terms of population surge, infrastructure, and 101 other issues. So the truth is that the whole system of refugee management set up after the Second World War is quite unable to cope with what is happening now. And I think the latest figure I remember reading is that something just under 400 million people on our planet are now living in a country other than the country in which they were born. A lot of them are fleeing difficult environmental, political and other conditions. And this flood tide shows no signs of changing. And ultimately, I think if I were to turn around to my electorate in Beaconsfield and say, I think we've got to have a policy of saying that anybody who's living in difficult circumstances can come to the United Kingdom, so you've got to brace yourself for the possibility that the population of this country is going to double or triple. in a very short period of time, because I think that's the sort of scale of which we might well be talking, I think my constituents would say this is impossible. So we have this conflict between our humanitarian instincts, the ethical discomfort we feel about excluding people, each one of whom has an individual story that may well merit them being welcomed, and yet not knowing what we've got can do, because in truth we would never be able to cope with the totality of it. And I think we need to have a proper discussion about that. I mean, one of the reasons why I've always been of the view that UKIP detest this 0.7% aid figure. And lots of my constituents write to me and say this money is being wasted. Well, actually, I don't think it is being wasted. It may be insufficient, but if we are helping capacity build in the country is concerned, it's not usually being used to distribute rice or wheat. It's being used to provide water supplies. In my own department, I used to go abroad to look at capacity building and providing legal services and rule of law. If we can help in that way, we can lessen this flow. But it is, I think, it must be one of the principal challenges facing Western Europe collectively in the developed world of how we cope with this. And Britain has 62 million people. I suppose we could accommodate 90 million or 100 million people, but it'll be a very different place. And I do think we have to have regard to the realities of what we can reasonably accommodate. So I don't think there's any easy answer to this. But I think it might be time for politicians to start talking about some of the underlying issues, which on the whole, there's a slight tendency to try to gloss over.
Okay, and moving on, you say there should be greater education about the need for surveillance to combat terrorism. But does blanket surveillance on society actually work?
Blanket surveillance on society is a terrible concept, and I'm absolutely satisfied from my time as Attorney General that we do not have blanket surveillance on our society. I think this has been the absolute root of the Snowden issue. Yeah. Now, I accept that part of the problem is that because the agencies operate, in a sense, secretly, but to government, there is a belief that grows that the agencies are above or outside the law, may do. Now, it's not to say that the agencies don't have a capacity to break the law. Like anybody else, they can do it inadvertently, or sometimes they might even do it deliberately, in which case it's a very serious matter indeed. But actually, my own experience is that the agencies are, for the most part, scrupulous in their desire to observe the law, and that in this country we have a commissioner system in place to scrutinise their work, quite apart from government doing a degree of scrutiny of their work, which ought to provide a high level of reassurance that they are not carrying out mass surveillance, which they are not allowed in law to do at all. Indeed, far from it. The targeted nature of their work is absolutely central, and it has to be reasonable, necessary and proportionate to any of the legitimate aims that they have of preventing terrorism, acquiring intelligence about threats to the United Kingdom, or helping bring criminals or terrorists to justice. And in my time as attorney, I never saw any sign in my time that this was not happening. And they will get legal advice and act on legal advice in areas of difficulty. Now, there may well be an opportunity post-Snowden. I think it's generally accepted that the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which is the sort of legal framework for much of their work, is rather old-fashioned. It was, it's early 2000s, but the technology has moved on. I think if there's widespread acceptance, we need a new structure. There may well be improvements that we can do, including greater judicial oversight. But when all that's been said and done, I'm absolutely satisfied that we are not living in a mass surveillance society. And therefore the basic premise for me is not there. And if you go and look at the evidence, because I went to sort of second guess it, which Syrian Lobban gave to the parliamentary committee that looked into this, I think it's the last time that the head of GCHQ gave public evidence, and actually listen, look at what he says they are doing and what they are having to do in broad terms, it becomes quite clear to me, even from that, and I'm convinced of this, that they are not carrying out mass surveillance on the population.
Okay.
So Cameron is promising to provide an EU in-out referendum. With your experience, working with the EU counterparts, how realistic do you think this is? that we'll find a working, you know?
My impression from my visits to Europe and my engagement with counterparts in Brussels and the work I did is I think that there is a widespread recognition. There are two things. Firstly, I think that our European Union partners would like to keep us in the EU. And in order for that to happen, I think they recognise that there are areas of difficulty and where there is a need to provide change and reassurance for the United Kingdom. And I think they're willing to do that. Of course, they have political problems of their own. At the moment, the EU is not very popular in a large number of European states. We sometimes have a tendency to view our issues on the EU in isolation. I mean, France has a potentially serious risk of having a Front National, whether government, I don't know, but expanding its power, and they are, if not anti-EU, certainly dyed in the wool Eurosceptic. There are movements in Spain, you've seen what's happening in Greece. The Eurozone remains in a critical state, and I'm bound to say that although the Eurozone doesn't want treaty change, for understandable reasons, because it means they all have to have referendums, my feeling is that there is going to have to be treaty change at some time in the not very distant future. My view is that if we engage in negotiations which are not just seen as being promoting UK exclusiveness, but is designed to try to improve the workings of the EU and also clarify some areas which I think really do need clarification. I mean, I never want to see another East European Central Bank challenge to our ability to do Euro bond dealing in London. It was outrageous, and there must be a legitimate anxiety that if the Eurozone firms up, the countries which are not in the Eurozone could be excluded, and that's got to be dealt with. I think there are issues on regulation, although it is worth bearing in mind that the current Commission appears to me to be very different in its approach from its predecessor, which was extraordinarily power acquisitive, and the present one, despite Mr. Juncker's bad press, interestingly enough, seems to be very different in its approach. So I think there are opportunities. Now, you know, speculating on negotiation is never easy. I think the Prime Minister wishes to give the British public a real choice, and I personally am very much in favour of having a referendum. I think there's a huge democratic deficit on the EU. It's been seen as being an elite project, and that is very damaging. You cannot proceed with elite projects where you can't carry your electorate with you. So we need a referendum. I'm perfectly happy with having the renegotiating period, but as I think I've said previously, I'm going to need a lot of persuasion that we should be voting to pull out, because at the moment I simply do not see how the benefits outweigh what I think would be very real costs.
I think we should move on to the general election. So why are the Tories doing better in the polls? I mean, taking what Cameron said, is 2 million more people in work, 750,000 more businesses in Britain, fastest growing economy in the Western world, sorry. Why are the Tories doing better at this stage? Surely they should be.
I think there may well be two reasons. Firstly, the first reason is that, yes, I think we have got a good record and we've got a good story to tell about what we've done over the last 5 years. But I don't think that we can minimise that change, particularly in areas where you are ultimately reducing government expenditure and having to bring about quite major changes to systems of government to do it, including reducing the size of the public sector, so 500,000 people have to change jobs and find other employment, admittedly taken up by 2 million jobs being created in the private sector, but nevertheless that's a very profound change. And where you are asking people, particularly those who may be less advantaged, that they're going to have to go through processes of change which may put them under quite a lot of pressure about changing the way they live and operate. And bear in mind the comment I made earlier about the number of people who've been taken off welfare, or for that matter the figure of the number of people now living in a household where one person is working. 900,000 people in this country are now living in a household where there's one earner compared to 2010. These are quite profound changes, and I don't think as politicians we should minimise that change is often quite painful and difficult. So when you come to an election and you're saying we think we've done the job right. We think that more of the same essentially is going to be needed, or we think that there will be, with greater inflow of tax revenues or lowering tax base, we will be able to do more within the public sector, the public service, to help areas of need. People will maybe willing to accept that. They may think that it's intellectually correct, but they'll also have a yearning for, oh, can't we shortcut this? And in a way, the Labour message is that, you know, they're offering a shortcut or an easing off. So I don't find that. I find that absolutely the classic area of political debate, and we'll have to see what happens over the next 8 days. There's some suggestion at the moment that perhaps our persuasion on this issue may be bearing fruit, but I'm not surprised that there are quite a lot of people who will be uncertain. I've never come across an election where there are more people unwilling to say how they're going to vote on the doorstep, and I've not only been in my own constituency. The second reason is a more profound one, I think, and I'm not sure quite what the answer is, but it's a challenge to us as politicians. And that is that I think the electorate have become extraordinarily fed up with presentational politics. By presentational politics, I mean the sort of politics that's evolved particularly under New Labour. Mr. Blair was the perfecter of it, but some people may argue it's originated earlier. I don't think I'm looking through rose-tinted spectacles when I say that I think that when I was young, the political debate was more robust, more open, less managed, and less reliant on sound bites than it is today. And I think there's a terrible lesson for us about this, because the justification for it, as perfected by New Labour under Mr. Blair, was that it worked to deliver parliamentary majorities. My personal opinion is that it is now no longer working at all, and that the more people hear it, the more disenchanted, dissatisfied, cynical they become, and I don't really blame them. The interesting thing is that the press are so intimately bound up to this process that for politicians to risk departing from it and actually being honest about some of the problems and challenges they face in a way that I think we are tending still to avoid in all political parties is a high-risk strategy. And you know, in the middle of an election campaign, it's probably a high-risk strategy that people may be rather reluctant to take on. But I do think that we're going to have to do something about this, because for me, the rise of UKIP, the SNP's attraction, are both way two sides of the same coin. They're about people sending out a very clear message that they find the way in which the politics are being conducted is a real turn-off. And we've got to do something about it.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think it's got anything to do with the fact Cameron is known, it's quite bland? He's been accused of having lack of energy in this campaign, and really it's only now he's sort of been a bit more invigorated. Do you think that's got anything to do with it?
I don't think the Prime Minister is bland at all. I mean, having worked with him over many years, blandness is not an attribute I would give to him. He is a person who is not by nature emotional. I mean, that's one of his great qualities. Watching him in government, dealing with him over the 4 years that I worked closely with him, it's an admirable quality that he's unruffled by crisis. He deals with people in a very plain manner. He doesn't seek praise. He doesn't give very much praise. He just expects his ministers to get on with the job. He listens carefully to them. He takes on board what they say. He either agrees or disagrees. He expects decisions to be implemented. And he's a good man in a crisis. Now that may come across as a lack of emotion, but actually it's some rather good qualities that I don't think in the course of the last few days I would see him as lacking in emotion in the way he's done it. I mean, it was noticeable also with the Scottish referendum that it was in the last week that he finally went out and said quite a lot, and actually I thought was rather a powerful figure. I have great admiration for him.
He's no Boris Johnson though, is he? Who's tipped possibly to be the next leader.
Well, Boris is a very different animal altogether. Boris is an entertainer, and actually that is, I don't mean that in any pejorative sense, but he is. He's somebody who makes people laugh, and by making people laugh, then makes them listen to the underlying message, which otherwise they might not accept. That's quite an interesting quality as well. And not necessarily one that makes him in any way unfit to be leader of the party. I should make that quite clear. I don't know where we'll go after the present Prime Minister ceases to be in office or leader of the Conservative Party. There are a number of possibilities.
There were reports that headed off though that Boris would take over from Cameron if he fails to win an overall majority. Is that true?
I think that is classic press folly and speculation. And let me tell you why. Firstly, we have no idea where we will be after polling day. I hope very much we have a Conservative government with David Cameron as the Prime Minister, and that is what will happen if we get a Conservative government. But on top of that, I don't think that the press have the slightest idea what the views of the new Conservative Party in Parliament are going to be.
Apparently it came from top senior figures in the party.
Yeah, well, I'm always a bit wary of top senior figures in the party. It's like top judges. If anybody gets into trouble, they're a top judge, and you discover they're a recorder. And similarly, with senior figures in the party, anybody who wishes to get on the telephone and express themselves will immediately be representing the party. They're not. The party is very diverse, like any broad church. There are lots of senior members of the party. I certainly haven't been commenting on it. In those circumstances, I would be a bit wary. And do bear in mind that I can't remember what the figure is likely to be, but the Conservative Party after the next election will have a lot of newcomers. Even if our numbers stay approximately the same, their views have not been canvassed. They're unknown. They'll have to be taken on board. I think it's rubbish, actually.
It's unlikely, though, you'll be able to form a government, even if you come first. With the Tories, DUP, UKIP, Lib Dems, you still cannot form a majority government. So even if you come first, it's likely Labour will still form a coalition with the SNP.
Who would you be your preferred person?
I think it's fairly obvious that in view of our working relationship with the Liberal Democrats, if we didn't have a majority, the obvious partner to look to, if it were to deliver a majority, would be the Liberal Democrats. I mean, I say that because if you look around, I'm not sure, I certainly don't see, just do a rational analysis. UKIP, leaving aside the fact that I would be extraordinarily wary of doing any sort of deal with UKIP, because although UKIP may attract some Conservatives voters, it also attracts Labour voters, it also attracts some voters, people who used to vote for the BNP. And for that reason, it's not a party with which, I could perfectly decent people wish to vote UKIP, but as a party, it's not a party with which I would wish to have an association. And my view is that in any case, on the current polling evidence, although UKIP may have quite a profound influence on the outcome of the election in terms of votes, in terms of the number of MPs, it's likely to be insignificant. So, what's the point? You need to have a credible party with which you can build a coalition which is sufficient to command a majority or close to a majority.
But you won't be able to form a majority.
Well, it may well be that we end up with minority governments.
That's incredibly weak, though. It
is, but then it's going to be weak whichever way it goes, isn't it? It's going to be weak if it's a Labour minority government propped up by the SNP, or not propped up by the SNP, depending on how the SNP is feeling any day of the week. Or alternatively, if it's a minority Conservative government, it's going to be a roller coaster ride. Yeah. We may find that we end up with another election within 12 months, even with the current new system of fixed-term parliaments. I mean, none of this, I do worry about this, and all of you in here should worry, because there is a need for stability, particularly when you are at the very early stage of an economic recovery. Instability is unlikely to be very attractive to the international money markets, who are lending us lots of money to keep us afloat. Instability means that decisions get parked. Instability means that decisions get made which shouldn't be made because you're under pressure to make decisions which are in fact irrational, but are there to placate some particular group or faction within Parliament. And it's bad news. So that's one of the reasons why I would like to have a clear and decisive Conservative majority.
Yeah.
Do you want to watch, or should we
okay, how many marks would you give the Conservative and Robert coalition government for the last 5 years? You say the job's only half done, so 5 out of 10?
Oh no, because the job is never going to be possible to do the whole. If you have £1.4 trillion of debt, I think turning the place round in 5 years, we will be, if we can get to a point where we are in fact no longer engaged in deficit financing. Do bear in mind, if we bring the deficit to zero as we've undertaken by 2018, that will be the end, I think, of 18 years in deficit, which is actually outrageous because it shows the extent of Gordon Brown's folly in his borrowing in order to fund government expenditure in the good years. Forget about what happened after the bad years, because after all, he was doing this in years when the economy was doing well. Because if you remember, he kept on saying prudence. He said prudence allowed him to borrow as long as it was within an economic cycle where at the end of it, you hadn't borrowed. The only trouble is the economic cycle got longer and longer and longer. Such do debtors always justify their indebtedness. So, for me, the key issue is, I think the job, I never thought we were going to do the whole job in 5 years. I certainly wouldn't give us 10 out of 10, but no, actually, I would give us about 8.5 out of 10. I think that in some areas, you know, some of the anxieties I had when we set out, you know, were we going to have mass unemployment, which was a real anxiety, and rather miraculously we didn't get, but actually that was because the economy started to pick up rather faster than some of us had expected. You know, if you remember, we were told we were going to have triple-dip recessions and double-dip recessions. And we avoided it. We've been, well, some people will say we've been lucky. But actually, I think in creating the basic climate where you can generate wealth, where you can reassure the international money markets that you're good for the money, and actually, some people have argued you've been much less ruthless about cuts than you originally gave the impression you might be. I think overall that's a pretty good success story. But that's not to say we've done everything right. And as always happens in government, you look ahead and you can see lots of other things that we are going to need to tackle. And some of the issues are going to be very difficult. Defence is going to be very difficult because the international situation has changed dramatically since 2010. And I think there are going to be some quite difficult decisions we're going to have to take on that.
Well, Dominic Grieve, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.